Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the case and the charges against Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who has been held in a London prison since 2019, where he is fighting an extradition order to be tried in the United States over the U.S. classified documents that WikiLeaks published in 2010 concerning the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. My guest for this is Kevin Gosztola. Kevin Gosztola has been covering these issues, including Assange, WikiLeaks, and whistleblowers for the past decade. He is co-founder and managing editor of Shadowproof, which is an independent news outlet, and curator of the Dissenter newsletter. He also produces and co-hosts a weekly podcast called Unauthorized Disclosure. He joins us for a conversation about his book. It's called Guilty of Journalism: The Political Case Against Julian Assange. Kevin Gosztola, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
What's the latest on the case and the extradition case concerning Julian Assange?
Currently, the extradition was authorized by the United Kingdom's government back in the summer of 2022, which means that the district court there signed off on the extradition request. It went to the desk of the Home Office, which is kind of like, we could see it as similar to like the State Department of the United States. And there, at the time, it was Home Secretary Priti Patel. She's no longer in that position. She signed off on the request for the United States. And then Julian Assange's legal team, were able to submit their appeals, which they had been waiting to file because they wanted to contest other aspects of the extradition decision. But in this very complicated, legal, tangled web, you had the U.S. actually losing in January of 2021 because the district court ruled that it would be oppressive for health reasons to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. So then that meant that the U.S. had to actually appeal it if they wanted to extradite Julian Assange. And then you had this bizarre moment where it looked like maybe Julian Assange could prevail. Or I guess bizarre is not really the right word. It's surreal, because you didn't expect that you would be able to overcome what the U.S. was trying to do. But now there was a small opening because in court, the U.S. was going to have to argue that the prison system was not inhuman, that they weren't going to have trouble protecting Julian Assange, that he wouldn't be able to take his own life, and that his health would be taken care of.
And that's what
all of this.
But that's what the previous judge in London said. No, I don't trust the U.S. prison system. Was that the basis of that?
Yeah, that's what it was. And really saying that she didn't believe that the prison system in the U.S. was one that if she let Julian Assange be extradited, they have human rights laws on their books that we don't exactly have in the United States, and people are sensitive. Usually extraditions go forward either way, but they are sensitive to issues of like whether it's going to be cruel and inhuman treatment to somebody if they are extradited to that country that is requesting extradition. So anyways, the U.S. ends up prevailing. They get the appeals court to overturn it, and then the Home Office authorizes it, which now means that they can go back, the legal team can, and file this appeal and say, okay, well, we believe that Julian Assange is a journalist. He has press freedom rights. We think that the judge had originally interpreted the extradition treaty between the U.S. and U.K. incorrectly. We think that the court should recognize that he's being accused of political offenses. These are the elements of the law that they are going to grapple over before an appeals court. And we're waiting to find out, but we think that in the next month or two, there should be some kind of a decision from the appeals court on whether he'll get to have a hearing and challenge the extradition decision, because that appeal was submitted in the summer of 2022, and it's been 9 months now. And that's a long time. I mean, we're talking about somebody who is in administrative detention in Belmarsh high security prison. He's being confined with people who are accused of terrorism and other violent crimes. And many of those people have been convicted. They're not awaiting trial. He is awaiting trial, but he also isn't even in the country where he'll be put on trial. And he has not been allowed out on bail, which is something we could get into later. But to end the answer to your question, we are waiting to see if he'll get his day in court to argue an appeal.
So it's not ensured that he will get to argue his appeal? Could
Not
this
necessarily.
extradition just happen sort of suddenly?
No, it won't happen suddenly. But what would happen is the appeals court would deny him the right to bring his appeal, and then he would have to turn to the Supreme Court and argue that they should give him a hearing. And it gets harder in the Supreme Court because if he's denied before the appeals court, he has to prove to the Supreme Court that he's raised a point of law that is important. And if they don't see him raising something new that like the Supreme Court hasn't dealt with before, then he won't get to have a hearing. Because in the earlier round, the US government won before the appeals court, and then Julian Assange's team had to appeal that decision to the Supreme Court. This is very complicated. It's easy to get lost in this round and around. I can sense listeners wondering where we are going and feeling like they might be lost in this description of the legal case. It is a pretzel. It twists around and around. But you get to the Supreme Court and his team has to file an appeal, and that court decided not to grant him a hearing. They determined that he wasn't raising anything new when it came to how it was an argument over how he would be treated in U.S. custody. And so what we're waiting to find out then is, so if the Supreme Court decides that he isn't going to get a hearing, then he can go submit an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. And that is the final stage of trying to prevent being extradited to the United States. All of this, though, mind you, will take time. All of this is something we could be discussing a year from now. Yeah. And we might just only be reaching the Supreme Court stage next year. And then the European Court of Human Rights, that could take us to 2025. And then finally, maybe we're there where we can have a conversation about whether the U.S. truly is going to put someone who is accused of what I consider to be acts of journalism. Are they really going to put him on a plane and bring him to the United States for a trial that could be a defining moment? It would be one of the biggest cases in recent history if he was put on trial in the United States. So will President Joe Biden and his White House and others at the Justice Department under Attorney General Merrick Garland actually go forward and put him on the plane? And I break it up like that because there's a part there's a part of this that is, I think, lawfare. I believe, and I agree with Julian Assange's legal team that there's a lot of punishment by process in this. There's a benefit to how long this all takes. The U.S. government is okay with it taking a long time because all they really want, all they need, and this includes like people who are in the U.S. security agencies who want to see Julian Assange prosecuted, what they want, they're getting. They just want Julian Assange to not be able to work as the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief. They don't want WikiLeaks to be able to work on publications. They don't want him to be out there speaking against the U.S. government and showing up on CNN or Democracy Now! Or wherever else he might pop up. They don't want him on Twitter. And they're able to have what they would like by keeping him in confinement in Belmarsh prison. And so they're essentially getting the punishment that they want before they even get to the phase of the trial where they might be able to secure a conviction.
That's interesting. So the process itself might be the punishment. You could foresee a situation where they decide not to try him in the United States if he's unsuccessful in his appeals in London?
Yeah, so let's imagine that we get to 2025 and everything's exhausted with the appeals. Well, first off, we would have to consider who's in the White House. Is it Joe Biden? did the Democrats survive whatever the Republicans are going to try to put forward as their candidate, which we'll go ahead with conventional wisdom here just for the sake of making it easy to have this conversation. So Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis is the nominee for the Republican Party against Joe Biden. Was Joe Biden able to win re-election? If no, then we've got a Republican. And could it be that this time Donald Trump is reelected and this time Donald Trump decides he's not going to listen to the security or military agencies and he is going to go ahead and pardon Julian Assange? I write about in my book a moment that happened in the final months of Donald Trump's presidency. He was considering a pardon for Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower. He was considering a pardon for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And he was threatened by GOP senators like Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, others who said, if you give pardons to Snowden or Julian Assange, we are going to vote to impeach you. They had an impeachment hearing or proceedings in the House, and then it was to go to a vote in the Senate.
So we backed down. This is over the situation with Ukraine and the weapons.
No, this was tied to January 6th.
Okay.
This was based on the alleged acts of the Trump administration to deny the reality of what happened with the outcome of Joe Biden's victory.
Yeah.
And so, because we had these impeachment proceedings, and so then they decide that they're going to threaten Donald Trump to make sure that he doesn't let Julian Assange or Edward Snowden off the hook. Edward Snowden, just for your listeners, is living in exile in Moscow, where he was essentially stuck in an airport there and could not continue on his way to Ecuador because the State Department revoked his passport, leaving him to decide either to turn himself over to authorities to be arrested and brought back to the United States, or he could accept or he could pursue asylum from Russia, which is what he ended up doing. And now he has Russian citizenship that he applied for before the war in Ukraine broke out. And so this is what was happened. So could Donald Trump decide to stand up to the security agencies, stand up to some of the military people in his administration, maybe some of his national security advisors that he might bring into his circle who are hawkish, who are going to be pro intervention and taking decisive military action, but he could persuade them that Julian Assange should be spared? I don't know. If Joe Biden is reelected, he doesn't really have any liability anymore when it comes to continuing Julian Assange's case. He doesn't have to worry about it affecting him. He's not going to go for re-election. So, because he can't, he has a second term. And however, we do have values, or we do have a way that we project ourselves as the United States that says that we support freedom of the press. We want the world to believe that we protect this idea. And we might be losing something. It's possible that we might be losing something if Julian Assange is extradited. So there might be a serious conversation about what is the risk to the United States' image to the world, in the same way that they talked about Guantanamo Bay prison and how everyone was rounded up there and they were put in this parallel system of justice that wasn't really just at all, where people were there and they weren't given trials and they were in indefinite military detention. And, now we know that like 90 to 95% of them were released. They were innocent. They weren't accused of anything at all, ever charged with any crimes. That did a lot to damage the United States' image in the world. I mean, the same might be said for bringing Julian Assange, the first journalist to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, to the United States, or the first publisher to be prosecuted, at least, to the United States, and then to have him put on trial in a manner that suggests he engaged in sedition against the United States. I mean, first off, he's not a U.S. citizen. He's not somebody who should have to follow United States laws. And it's a departure, or it's quite I think, an encroachment on people throughout the world to say that the U.S. gets to control what foreign journalists do in their coverage of the United States and its global actions. So would that really be something that would do irreparable harm to the United States' image. And maybe Joe Biden and his team would decide that they're going to abandon the extradition, because by the time we get to 2025, that will be 8 years. That will be 6 years that he has been in prison at Belmarsh. It'll be 8 years since a pressure campaign thereabouts around 2017 began to try and force him out of the Ecuador embassy that was led by Mike Pompeo when he was CIA director. It'll be 13 years since he entered the Ecuador embassy. What I'm trying to make, my point is basically there has been punishment. And if he's convicted under the Espionage Act, he probably would do a sentence that was like 5 to 7 years, maybe 7 or 8 years. Okay, he got 8 years in Belmarsh prison. That might be enough punishment for the United States to say that, like, if they let him go, it's not like he got off the hook. He was punished. He was severely punished for 8 years in a high security prison in London.
And he's also been made an example of.
Yes. Yeah. And people know that this is what could happen to you if you publish national security documents from the United States.
What is the justification of keeping him in jail in London? When he was arrested, when he lost asylum from Ecuador, he was sentenced to something like 50 weeks in jail for a bail violation. Obviously, those 50 weeks are up a long time ago. What's the justification of keeping him in prison now?
The United States does not recognize that he sought political asylum. They don't treat that as legitimate, that he was granted political asylum by Ecuador. President Rafael Correa, when he was the leader of Ecuador, extended this asylum. Julian Assange's legal team, it was led by a very renowned human rights attorney named Michael Ratner, helped put together an application.
The late, great Michael Ratner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was a fantastic human being. And he submitted the application. It laid out what he thought would happen if Julian Assange complied with extradition and went to Sweden because he was accused of these sexual allegations. And that case had many due process issues. It wasn't that those women who made the accusations didn't deserve a time to bring forward their claims, but it was that the Swedish prosecution authority was not treating the defendant appropriately, and the defendant being Julian Assange. And so as the accused, he did not want to go to Sweden. He was afraid that he'd be handed over to the United States, that it would be used as sort of this kind of a go-between site that could then allow for and make it easier for him to be processed and given over to the United States for a trial. He resisted. He agreed to be questioned from within the embassy, but that was thwarted. It was resisted by we know from emails that have been released that the Crown Prosecution Service was resistant to this idea of allowing somebody from Sweden to come question him in the embassy, even though there's a treaty that would have allowed for that to happen. They could question him about it and figure out if they really wanted to charge him. They did not really ever officially charge him with any crimes. They just said that he was alleged to have engaged in this misconduct. And so you get to this accusation that he's bail jumping, because when he went to get political asylum, he was out on bail, having been accused of a crime. And that became the pretext that the UK government, with support from the US, held over Julian Assange in order to give them the reason for putting him in prison, putting him in detention after he got tossed out of the Ecuador embassy. So to state that a little bit more concisely, the reason why it was so bad for Julian Assange when Ecuador revoked his asylum, why British authorities could come in and just carry him and drag him to the van, as we've seen. It's one of the most vivid images of Julian Assange that's been looped and played over and over again since April 2019 when it occurred. The reason that was possible is because they kept this charge hanging over his head that gave the police the justification to go in and snatch him and then load him in. And that way there was never a point in which he could just leave the embassy and try to get on a diplomatic plane to leave the country, or try to get in a car or a van and leave London on his own terms. They had this charge that was on the books that was always hanging over his head. That would mean that they could just put him behind bars. And so the bail jumping is a political kind of crime that they've used it politically. It's not like bail jumping to you and me usually would probably mean that, like, I got out on bail for something that, I don't know, maybe I was drunk in public or whatever, and then I violated the terms of my bail, perhaps. And then that's why somebody can come and snatch me and put me back in jail. But what they're saying is seeking asylum turned him into a fugitive. And so we have to put him in detention because he fled law enforcement and we no longer had control over him. So that's why we've put him in detention. And that's why we won't allow him to be out on bail, because they're actually afraid that he might seek asylum with another country and then they would lose the ability to extradite him to the United States. And they used this. So they used this during the pandemic. He made a claim that he was at high risk because of his health, that he needed to be released from prison, like a lot of people did during the height of the pandemic in those first months. They wouldn't allow him out. He's made applications for bail. They've been denied. He won his case in January 2021. They had a bail hearing 2 days later. The U.S. was able to convince and persuade a judge that he would try and jump bail again, or that he might be a flight risk, because Mexico, which is run by AMLO, or Obrador is the president of Mexico, has been a really big supporter of Assange. He met with Joe Biden, I believe, earlier this year, and he told Biden directly that he thinks the administration should free Julian Assange. And Mexico was supportive and had offered to extend asylum to Julian Assange. And they believe that he might take this opportunity, if he was out on bail, to go to Mexico's embassy. And then Julian Assange would no longer be available for the U.S. to prosecute. So they kept him in detention for that fact. And that's what the bail jumping charge is. It's a refusal to recognize political asylum.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Kevin Gosztola. Kevin Gosztola is a journalist who's been covering Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and whistleblowers for more than a decade now. He is the author of the book, Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. The charges, and there are many charges, including the Espionage Act charges that are being brought from the United States against Julian Assange, these all pertain to the release of the documents back in 2010 through WikiLeaks, the documents that were obtained from Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, the documents concerning Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yes, all of the charges are about those documents. The only thing that sort of veers away from just the documents in general is there's a third indictment that I detail in the book. And it came just months before a major extradition hearing where the defense got to challenge the U.S. extradition request and bring witnesses. These are people like Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg, who made statements to the court on behalf of Julian Assange, and others who were involved in different phases of Julian Assange's defense, like psychiatrists who could speak about his health, doctors who had treated him in the embassy. And let's see, they added these allegations about hacking to make it more clear that Julian Assange is not a journalist, because they know that they have to do that in order to get this through, in order to have the charges survive.
And that charge is related to helping Chelsea Manning.
Yeah. Hack. So they added allegations to this allegation of to what was already there. So there was a crime. The first crime that was announced against Julian Assange when he was arrested, there were no Espionage Act offenses initially that were revealed by the Justice Department. They revealed one charge, and that was they accused Julian Assange of conspiracy to commit a computer intrusion. which was that he had helped Chelsea Manning to crack a password in order to access a Pentagon computer. Something that I find to be wildly absurd because Chelsea Manning had access. She had a security clearance. She could go to any databases on that computer, and she did not have to get any assistance, any outside help.
Maybe I don't. Would not have. Maybe I don't get this right, but isn't the charge that Julian Assange helped Chelsea Manning hack into the computers through a different account so that Chelsea Manning couldn't be traced to it?
Well, essentially, that's sort of what they're arguing, that she needed to find a way to cloak herself so that she could access the databases so that the Pentagon wouldn't know that she was pulling certain documents or files for WikiLeaks. And they want to make it seem like Julian Assange recruited her and put her up to making decisions and choices about what material to give to WikiLeaks. That they argue that he solicited classified information and tried to get her to leak to WikiLeaks. But she gave a statement in court before she had her trial when she pled guilty to some of the offenses that the military accused her of committing. And she laid out the timeline, the narrative of events, and she laid out why she chose each set of documents. And it doesn't match up at all with the claims that the U.S. government is making about Julian Assange. They're in conflict, which this is sort of a separate issue, but it gets to why they gave her a grand jury subpoena back in March of 2019, before Julian Assange had been arrested. And they tried to force her to testify against Julian Assange. And when she resisted, they put her in jail for a year before she was released and allowed to go.
And you covered her You covered her case closely. You were at Fort Leavenworth working on this at the time.
I was at Fort Meade, to cover the court martial, and then at the time she was in military prison at Leavenworth before she had her sentence commuted by President Obama. And so this charge, there's hacking allegations that were added. So you're right. These are all documents from 2010 and 2011, but then they added this stuff to make it seem like Julian Assange was engaged in activity that was intended to try and destabilize government agencies, to attack Iceland's government, some of the government agencies in Iceland. They use an informant named Ziggy Tordarson, who's accused of criminal activity. I don't want to go too much into him before I complete this answer, but they also bring up Edward Snowden. They bring up the assistance that WikiLeaks gave to help Edward Snowden leave Hong Kong, because Sarah Harrison, who's an unindicted conspirator, she appears in the indictment, but they don't name her. So she could be exposed to potential prosecution. That's why she hasn't returned to the UK. I think she lives in Germany. And she accompanied Edward Snowden on his trip and ended up being with him while he was stuck in the airport at Moscow, made sure that he got asylum before she left his side. And she was trying to take seriously the responsibility of source protection, the idea that Edward Snowden at great sacrifice had exposed these documents, which we now know have reformed certain surveillance laws that were on the books. They've changed the way we think about what the government does when it comes to using these surveillance programs and all the tools that they have at their fingertips. But The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post, some of these other outlets that published, they never did anything to step up and ensure Edward Snowden's safety. So it was WikiLeaks that sent somebody there, made sure that he was able to get on an airplane, and helped him to leave Hong Kong so he wouldn't be arrested by the U.S. government or authorities working for the U.S. government. And that's being criminalized in this case as well.
A big question is whether or not WikiLeaks and Julian Assange himself is a journalist and then deserves sort of journalistic protections. The government argues, the United States government argues, that he's not a journalist. And I think the argument goes along the lines, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that receiving classified documents and just publishing everything that is there is not actually journalism. What journalism is receiving those documents, combing through them, curating what's important, weaving together a story, and then telling that story. And you may or may not release the documents as well. Sometimes you do release the documents, but in releasing the documents, you also take care to make sure that, private information about individuals, really sensitive information that may not pertain to the story that you're telling, is not included in there. And that one of the things that WikiLeaks has done by publishing all of these documents has put people unintentionally in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. That is the U.S. government's argument. And, and a lot of it also has to do with the journalistic responsibility that they think a reporter or a media organization should have when they're handling these documents, and believing that Julian Assange was not sensitive to the claims of the U.S. government. So, for example, if they say, well, we don't think these documents should be published, it will expose an informant, or it'll expose human rights activists that were working with us, then you should not publish that material and include their names. So that's what they've come after Julian Assange with. That's the argument in their indictment, which I boldly reject in my book, because the first words I write in the first chapter of the book are Julian Assange is a journalist. And I use the definition that the Committee to Protect Journalists uses for Julian Assange, because not only is he, as a publisher, engaging in journalism by putting the documents up on a website for everyone to access, but he's also engaged as a commentator. He's appearing on radio. He's appearing on Democracy Now! He's writing books about Google. He's engaged in the conversation about NSA surveillance. He's brought on as an expert. I think he was even on CNN a few times to talk about this subject. And he writes columns or an op-ed for papers, and they're not just obscure, tiny, minor papers. He was offered a chance to write about these issues for the Washington Post at least a few times. And so that, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, makes you a journalist who should be protected. If he's going to be prosecuted by a U.S. law, and that's the Espionage Act, and then he's accused of a conspiracy to defraud the government in the U.S., that's basically where the computer crime intrusion, I think, falls under. It's not really just a straight up computer. So there's a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act law, the CFAA. It's not just straight up under there. It's a little bit more of a general conspiracy charge. If he's going to be charged under the United States' laws, then he should have the same constitutional rights that we do when we get accused of committing offenses. So those would be like the First and the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment protections that we have, along with others like, the Sixth Amendment, so on and so forth. And he has engaged in that activity, so I believe he should be protected, and the U.S. government shouldn't be able to circumvent it and deny him the ability to be protected. President Obama's administration, the Justice Department, saw the dilemma of charging Julian Assange before Donald Trump and believed that this was something that could get in the way of a successful prosecution. Donald Trump's people were very open about not caring about the First Amendment holding them back in charging Julian Assange. Mike Pompeo spoke very openly in his first speech as CIA director about how WikiLeaks to him was a non-state hostile intelligence service, and he wasn't going to let the First Amendment hold him back from targeting WikiLeaks. And so the CIA, as we know from Yahoo News, Michael Isikoff and a couple other reporters got together and talked to over 30 sources that were in parts of the government, including the Trump administration itself, shared details about how there were war plans that were allegedly sketched out by other officials, plotting to maybe kidnap or poison Julian Assange while he was in the embassy, to engage in a disruption campaign against WikiLeaks, to go against the digital infrastructure of the WikiLeaks website, to try and turn people in WikiLeaks against each other, do whatever they could to make it impossible for WikiLeaks to function and bring it down, and wage a pressure campaign, really aggressively lobbying Ecuador's government to eventually, and they eventually succeeded, they pressed them really hard to expel Julian Assange from the embassy. And so I think he is a journalist. I do think it's worth grappling over it too. I hear a lot of people say, well, it doesn't matter if you believe he's a journalist or not. you can at least accept that he engaged in journalism by publishing the material, and that should be protected. I mean, we have a First Amendment right to publish. We have a First Amendment right to publish hacked materials too. That's also recognized. There is no law in our country against publishing classified information. In the United Kingdom, they have an Official Secrets Act, but we don't have that. They use the Espionage Act as a de facto official secrets law in the United States, but it does not say, there is no law on our books that says, if I get a classified document, it's against the law for me to publish it. Just, I can go post it on Twitter right now and share it with anybody, and it's allowed under the First Amendment. And it's allowed for you and any of your listeners, if they received classified information, they can publish it. It's protected conduct. So I think that we do have to quibble with people over this issue. If you do care, if you're someone who finds yourself caring about what's at stake, and as a professional journalist, I find myself on Julian Assange's side because I don't want other people to be next in line. I don't want somebody who is, maybe just an independent or alternative journalist, a lot like me, who doesn't have institutional support, who can't hire a lawyer. I think it's different. So like the New York Times and the Washington Post have lawyers who can haggle and negotiate with government attorneys at the Justice Department so that they can avoid being charged with anything serious. But I don't have that access. I don't have that ability. I don't have that power. I can't do that. So I'm more vulnerable to, if I were to engage in this kind of work, being raided, subpoenaed, being targeted by the government for doing national security journalism. That is really what is central to the focus of this case.
How do you respond to the allegation that WikiLeaks, in publishing, hundreds of thousands of documents, have put human rights activists in danger, ranging from interpreters in Afghanistan, human rights activist in Zimbabwe, who was outed for actually meeting, I think, with U.S. embassy personnel, very similar situation in Belarus?
Yeah, so that claim comes from an unfortunate set of circumstances that unfolded in 2011 when David Lee, who was the Guardian editor who had worked on the documents, published in his book that he co-authored with Luke Harding, he published the password to an encrypted file that had been given to him by, I believe it was Julian Assange himself who gave him this password. He wrote it down, and for whatever reason, he felt it was, I guess, a nice flourish for his book to make the chapter heading a password. And he claims that he thought that it was a temporary password, but I think what it comes down to is David Lee was technologically illiterate, and he then exposed that file because the file was posted on the internet. It was widely available to journalists around the world who were working on the material. So they had the password, and they were supposed to go online and find the file. They would be given like the location of it. They would download the file and they would work with it. It was quite common. There are people involved in computer security that said this isn't reckless. This is a common way of working with material that it could be sensitive. And so then there was a German publication that figured out that password could be connected to a file, and they were able to crack it. And once that was opened, now there are all sort of malicious and nefarious people out there who are able to mine that information and do things that are negative. Julian Assange cared deeply about what was going to be the fallout from this. He contacted the State Department. He tried to get Hillary Clinton on the line. He tried to get people important. He did have a conversation with an official at the State Department to warn them that they needed to do something. Why it had taken so long to do something to protect the people in the documents is a crucial question, because they knew back in the middle of 2010 that these people who were named in these documents could be exposed to danger. They had already arrested Chelsea Manning, and yet it came to the middle of 2011 and they were panicking. They were running around saying the sky is falling, because now all these documents were out on the internet, over 250,000. They were not redacted or censored or managed the way that they had been, because WikiLeaks, contrary to popular opinion, had not dumped the cables online. They had been working meticulously through sets of cables, partnering with various media organizations around the world, and they were going to continue this project. It got disrupted by the unfortunate chain of events that took place. And that was when you had The Guardian run an op-ed or run a column that was signed on by Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, accusing WikiLeaks of committing an act of wrongdoing against people who had generally been supportive of them, human rights activists. That was when you had people who had been generally supportive of WikiLeaks and Assange who were now against the actions of WikiLeaks. They believe that they should not be publishing those documents, but the counter from WikiLeaks was that they should cover this material. They should make it available to everyone, because then those people who were in vulnerable positions could go on the database. They could search for their name. They could see if they needed to do anything to protect themselves, because who knows if the US government was going to contact them and warn them that they were endangered. And then they could take the precautions that they needed to try and prevent themselves from facing harm. And it's, I know that there's a debate and a discussion to be had about what is the appropriate decision to make ethically, but they did honestly consider these questions, and it wasn't like they wanted to see people get killed as a result of this mishap.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's also a privacy issue here to be worked through, that some people are concerned. Does WikiLeaks go through documents and look for information that could harm people before they publish them?
Well, yes. Yeah. In the case of the Iraq war logs, they held back 15,000 documents before. I believe it was the Iraq war log documents. They held back 15,000 of those files that never got published. So they are mindful of these issues. They're mindful of these certain, people that are being collaborated with. They don't want to do harm necessarily, but they also have to, in their mind, they also have to weigh the critical question of, like, who are these people that are collaborating with the U.S. military? What are they doing? If they're furthering the war effort, then there may be a case to be made that it should be known what role they're playing. Are they? So let's just, I don't have an example available, but let me just make a hypothetical example. Let's say that in the cables, they found that these activists who the U.S. State Department wants to protect were actually involved in planning regime change in the country that is, they wanted to bring down the government. So to reveal that could be in the public interest. It might be really valuable for those people in that country to know that the U.S. was working with a group of activists to try to bring down their government, and that they weren't going to let democracy play out and let people try and force a revolution peacefully, but that they, wanted to have chaos and try and bring about a change in who was running the country by having these activists take certain actions, whatever that might be. So I think WikiLeaks is sensitive to all the different ways in which the U.S. works throughout the world, militarily, diplomatically. And they say, maybe some of these people aren't quite as innocent as these other organizations would claim. And so I think that's one thing to consider, along with that privacy question of, should those people be exposed? Because, there were many, many, many diplomatic cables in which there were people whose names were removed up until the point that the website lost control of the documents because they had been exposed and compromised.
Then there's the charge, and I don't mean legal charge, I should be clear here, but the public opinion charge, I guess, in the public sphere, that WikiLeaks has not operated in, that is more of an activist organization than a journalistic organization, and they will point to the release. And this, well, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe this is part of the charges that are levied against Julian Assange, but they point to the release of John Podesta's emails from 2016, yep, who was with Hillary Clinton campaign, and the DNC emails, and they will point, and the charge is that Julian Assange was purposefully, and WikiLeaks was purposely trying to keep Hillary Clinton from from being elected. That you had no emails, you had no documents that came from the RNC or from the Trump campaign.
Yes. Yes. So the way I deal with that in the book is just to point out that Robert Mueller, who was the special counsel, he investigated the allegations that there was some kind of Trump-Russia collusion and that WikiLeaks played some kind of a role in boosting Donald Trump's campaign, and that these documents were part of some kind of a Russian intelligence operation, and that WikiLeaks was publishing them wittingly or unwittingly, and they were beneficial to the Trump organization, and that was the intention. The intention was to bring down Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump win the presidency, and they just weren't able to find anything that we could call a smoking gun that made it possible to bring charges or anything serious against WikiLeaks. It was not something that was ever substantiated. WikiLeaks themselves, Julian Assange in particular, insisted that the emails that they received, that they published, did not come from a state party. We like to question sources when there are stories like this that happen. Unfortunately, we do have to respect journalists who say, I'm not going to discuss my sources, because that gets into sensitivity issues. It gets into confidentiality. And I think the question is, was there newsworthiness? Was there news value to the publication of those Clinton campaign emails? And nobody would argue, I believe, or they shouldn't argue, that those were of news value. What we were seeing in those emails, to refresh people's memory very briefly, was that the Democratic Party was running a primary process that had made it easier for Hillary Clinton to win the nomination and made it harder for anyone who was her challenger to compete against her in the race. And so that was, I think, something that people deserve to know, what the conversations, the ongoing mechanics of what it was like to operate within the Democratic Party during that time period. And we also saw that the Democratic Party had this thing of like boosting really extreme Republican candidates to be the eventual person that Hillary Clinton would face in the election, because they believed that would be easier for Hillary Clinton to win. Of course, Donald Trump ended up getting elected, and that was kind of a mistake on their part to believe that it would be just so easy to face somebody who was unhinged. And that was the essence of this Clinton campaign material. And people do get really angry at Julian Assange because he was open about his politics. He said things that were very negative and potentially you could call them demeaning towards Hillary Clinton because he didn't like her. But we have to remember, she was in charge of she was the Secretary of State when he published those documents that he's being prosecuted over right now. She felt like something was done to her by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks that was wrong. She felt like she was the victim when those State Department cables were published by WikiLeaks. And he believed that she, as president, would have no sympathy for him and would not help him to get out of the embassy and to be free. He didn't know what Donald Trump would do. He thought that was like, maybe there's a small possibility that I might be able to get free from the Ecuador embassy if Donald Trump is elected. And he tried to see things that were negative in Hillary Clinton. Some of them were real, and maybe some of them were a bit of his like figments of imagination or wishful thinking, so that he could make the statements that he was making about who he thought would be preferable to his case after the election. As it turned out, he was wrong. And I think he'd be, and the people around him would be the first to admit that they were wrong to believe that Donald Trump would be someone who would support him. Because even if he spoke out supportively of WikiLeaks files, because he liked reading what was in the Clinton campaign emails or how they, took some heat off his campaign, he put people in his administration who were hostile to Julian Assange and did not allow him to get free.
Kevin Gosztola has been our guest. Kevin Gosztola is co-founder and managing editor of Shadowproof, which is an independent news outlet, and the curator of the Dissenter newsletter. He also produces and co-hosts the weekly podcast called Unauthorized Disclosure. He has joined us for a conversation about his book. It's called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. Kevin Gosztola, thank you very much.
Thank you.